Hello, everyone, and welcome to the BYU Library Family History webinar. We're glad you could join us today. I'm Olivia Tuller, and I'll be your host for this webinar. If you have technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat box and I can address your concerns. You are welcome to use the chat box during the webinar for comments, insights, and questions. However, all questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our next webinar is on June 29th with Catherine Grant. She will be giving a presentation entitled Top Tips for Cleaning Up Fragments in Family Search Family Tree. If you would like to access a previous webinar, please visit our webinar index on our website or search in our YouTube channel. All of our webinars are recorded and uploaded by the following Monday for your convenience. We also post links to recordings and other updates on our Facebook and Twitter accounts. For today's webinar, we are pleased to hear from Bonnie L. Bossert, who will be giving a presentation on investigative genetic genealogy. Before we begin, here's a little bit about Bonnie. Bonnie Bossert is a genetic genealogist. She has taught a 4-hour DNA kindergarten course for several years for genealogy enthusiasts and lectures on a variety of genealogy and DNA topics. She is a board member of the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Accreditation Board, an independent nonprofit group that is developing and examine standards for the field of investigative genetic genealogy. And if Bonnie is ready, we can turn the time over to her.
Thanks so much, Olivia. Let me share my screen with you. All right, well, thank you all for having me here to talk about my recent favorite genealogy topic, investigative genetic genealogy, or IGG. Many of you may enjoy a good mystery or a true crime story. Today, I'm going to share some information on a less than decade-old initiative in genealogy that's being used to solve mysteries and crimes. It is a technique applied to solving cold cases and certain violent felonies. But first, let's take a look at the evolution of genealogy in America to see how we got here. Author Francois Weil, W-E-I-L, wrote a history of genealogy in America in 2013 titled Family Trees. He proposes that our democratic and multicultural society resulted in a unique approach to modern genealogy research. The author identifies 4 phases of information seeking and record keeping practices by American genealogists. The first phase was in the 18th century and paralleled the European understanding of legitimacy, aristocracy, and heraldry. During this American Revolution period, as a nation of immigrants, we began recording our own oral traditions and family records to keep the memory of ancestors alive or to establish kinship for family unity. Women were early custodians of family stories, creating samplers and recording family trees in Bibles. Phase 2, from the 1760s until the Civil War, saw a growth in local histories, biographies, and historical societies. The first genealogy books and journals were published at this time. The first genealogy network was created, the first genealogy library was built, and basic standards for using evidence and resources were established. We also saw the first career genealogist who charged for their services and the use of genealogy research in estate claim court cases and other litigation, a discipline known as forensic genealogy because it applied genealogy investigative techniques to property. Genealogy, unfortunately, was also used to wrongly assert racial superiority during this period. Genealogy also recorded social memory, established our bloodlines, and demonstrated a love of country. In phase 3, after the Civil War to the mid-20th century in the 1950s, we saw nationalist movements take hold and the idea of entitlement based on pedigree. Genealogy was marketed to those desiring to understand where they came from. In phase 4, emerging in the second half of the 20th century, the miniseries Roots came out in 1976. Spurring a huge interest in genealogy that coincided with the rise of digital access to the records used in genealogy. And here in the last 20 years, the use of DNA and genetics as genealogically relevant records came on the scene with the testing of Y-DNA, mitochondrial DNA, and autosomal DNA by commercial testing companies. Let's take a look at the evolution now of genetic genealogy. Genetic genealogy is defined by the International Society of Genetic Genealogy, or ISOG, as the application of genetics to traditional genealogy. It began in the 80s and 90s when scientists discovered and applied the use of mitochondrial DNA sequencing, DNA fingerprinting, and Y-DNA analysis to validate the use of DNA in confirming relationships and identifying ancient remains. DNA testing for family historians became available on a commercial basis in the year 2000 with mitochondrial and Y-DNA tests from family tree DNA. From 2007 through 2016, we saw the emergence of 23andMe, Ancestry, MyHeritage, and Living DNA, who provide consumer testing of autosomal DNA. In the last several years, we've also seen health and trait information identified for consumers based on their DNA. And now, investigative genetic genealogy has arisen to analyze DNA test results to develop leads for investigative agencies. The first use of DNA in criminal investigations goes all the way back to the 1980s, when forensic scientists used blood analysis and DNA fingerprinting. As early as 1987, Tommy Lee Andrews was the first American ever convicted in a case that utilized DNA evidence. In the 1990s, CODIS and NDIS were established. CODIS, the combined DNA index system operated by the FBI, was designed to compare a target DNA record against the DNA records contained in the database. It began in 1990 as a pilot project with 12 state and local forensic laboratories, and today has 153 participating labs. The National DNA Index System, or NDIS, is one part of CODIS, the national level, and it contains the DNA profiles contributed by federal, state, and local participating forensic laboratories. As of September 2020, NDIS contains more than 14 million offender profiles, more than 4 million arrestee profiles, and more than 1 million forensic profiles. The CODIS database has aided in over 520,000 investigations and produced more than 530,000 hits. In 2010, the public DNA comparison database, GEDmatch, was launched, creating a source of publicly available DNA test results where you could upload your DNA results to compare them to the results of other individuals in the database and identify potential DNA relatives, or more colloquially, matches. Then in 2016, IgG was applied to criminal investigations. The Golden State Killer was identified using IgG techniques. The case was documented in the book, I Know Who You Are, by Barbara Ray Ventnor, published in 2023. Detective Jim Scharf's 2018 cold case investigation of the 1987 double murder of Jay Cook and Tanya Van Culenborg in Washington State made history as the first IgG case to result in a court conviction. That case was documented in the book Forever Witness by Edward Humes, published in 2022. Today, the growth of investigative genetic genealogy requires establishing standards and ethics for the field. According to Tracy Lee Dowdeswell, a professor of criminology and legal studies at Douglas College in Canada, there are 545 cases that have been solved using IgG as of December 31st, 2022. So what is IgG and what skills do you need to have to actually do it? Well, IgG is a new field that combines traditional genealogy research methods with DNA genetic analysis to help identify unknown individuals or solve certain violent crimes. In order to do IgG, you have to have a certain set of skills. First, you need to have familiarity with our traditional genealogical methods, building family trees, using records for research. You also need a knowledge of DNA genetic inheritance. You need to have strong analytical and problem-solving capabilities, and you need to be proficient in communicating and explaining complex genetic concepts. Given the skill set needed, how exactly is IgG done? Well, DNA from a crime scene or unidentified human remains is processed in a forensic lab to create a DNA test kit. The processing of DNA is complicated because the DNA is often degraded and contains mixed samples, unlike your sample when you spit in a tube or swabbed your cheek. The lab processing costs are many thousands of dollars, and law enforcement may not have the funds to pursue all their cases. So many cases have been crowdsourced. The result of the forensic lab's effort is a DNA kit that can be uploaded to GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA law enforcement portals. Law enforcement cannot upload these DNA kits to Ancestry or 23andMe or MyHeritage, as it is against their terms of service and would be unethical. And IgG then researches the DNA relatives of the subject identified in the GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA databases to build family trees in the same way as we do research for adoptees to identify their biological parents. However, IgG is restricted to only the opted-in Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch DNA relatives of that uploaded kit. The IgG's research results in identifying a potential lead for law enforcement. Law enforcement detectives research the lead using existing investigative techniques, and if there is sufficient evidence, they collect a DNA sample from the suspect. If that suspect sample and the DNA profile in the CODIS database are a match, the suspect can be charged and arrested. Most of you have probably heard one or more of the cases that have been solved with leads generated using IgG. C.C. Moore, an investigative genetic genealogist who works with Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. on the show Finding Your Roots, and Margaret Press, the current CEO of the DNA Doe Project, are pioneers in this field who have provided the leads to solve most of the current cases. Some of the cases of rape, murder, kidnapping, and unidentified human remains solved by law enforcement using IgG include, as mentioned earlier, the Golden State Killer, who was sentenced for 13 murders and 50 rapes. Little 4-year-old Sharon Lee Gallegos, known as Little Miss Nobody, whose partially decomposed body was found over 500 miles from her home in New Mexico in 1960, was identified using IgG. Melissa Highsmith, who was only 21 months old when she was kidnapped by a woman from her home in Fort Worth, Texas in 1971, also was identified using IgG. And 4-year-old Joseph Augustus Zarelli, the boy in the box, America's unknown child, whose remains were discovered abandoned in Philadelphia in 1957, was identified using IgG in 2023. These cases and the many others demonstrate the power of this technique to solve mysteries and crimes. A question raised by genealogists is, how does IgG differ from traditional genealogy? Both IgG and traditional genealogists test their evidence by comparing and contrasting it. They also don't publish or publicize as fact anything they know to be false. And both of their works require analysis, correlation of evidence, and soundly reasoned conclusions. IgG differs in that it analyzes the DNA and builds family trees in order to provide a lead for a relationship, what a traditional genealogist would consider only a hypothesis. Once the lead is pursued by the investigating agency, a direct STR DNA comparison is done in CODIS. An IgG does not provide documentary evidence to support every single relationship in the IgG tree. It is not necessary for an IgG to prove a relationship according to the genealogical proof standard. So why should genealogists care about IgG? Well, there's 4 reasons. The use of public trees, your participation in the accessible databases, knowing the laws governing IgGs, and understanding of ethical practices. The first reason genealogists care about IgG is this use of public trees. Ever since the rise of computers, the information on our family trees has become more easily accessible. Digitized public records like censuses, land and property records, city directories, and others have made researching our ancestry easier for all of us. And trees at Family Search, Ancestry, MyHeritage, and other genealogical sites are public unless sent to private, and living people are not identified. These public trees allow genealogists to research their ancestry, identify common ancestors, and tell their family story. IgG uses public trees to research the families of the subject, using the subject's DNA relatives or DNA matches in the law enforcement databases only, those of Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch, for those individuals that have opted in to law enforcement matching. The second reason genealogists care about IgG is that with DNA testing, genealogists need to make informed decisions whether to share their DNA, and they need to discuss with their family and clients who choose to test their DNA whether their DNA results in the Family Tree DNA and GEDmatch databases can be used by investigating agencies. Remember that law enforcement cannot access the DNA test at Ancestry, 23andMe, and MyHeritage. To opt in at Family Tree DNA, you go to your account settings page and select the Privacy and Sharing tab, as shown in the circle at the top of the screen. There, you scroll down to the IgG section and click the button to opt in. To opt in at GEDmatch, when you upload a kit, you'll be asked whether or not you want to opt in. Once you are, your account will show police to the left of your account record, as shown on the left side of the screen here. And if you're opted out, there will be a red X over that police icon. If you've already uploaded a kit to GEDmatch, you can update your option in your account settings. The third reason genealogists care about IgG is that just as genealogists need to be familiar with the laws and regulations regarding the access to vital records like birth, marriage, and death certificates, IgGs need to be familiar with the laws governing the use of DNA. There are 2 laws to be aware of. The DNA Identification Act of 1994 authorized the establishment of the earlier mentioned National DNA Index System, or NDIS. NDIS contains, first, the DNA identification records of persons convicted of crimes. Secondly, analysis of DNA samples recovered from crime scenes. And thirdly, analysis of DNA samples recovered from unidentified human remains. The Act also establishes the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, the support platform database accessible across the states. Another law enacted in 2018 was the DOJ interim policy. It contains 9 sections that lay out critical law requirements for the use of IgG by law enforcement, including the collaborative interdisciplinary use of the technique, the criteria a case must meet in order to use IgG, the crimes that it can be used for, and how the practice is used to generate leads for unsolved crimes. Various states are also considering how IgG should be conducted and potentially regulated. The fourth reason genealogists care about IgG, and of the highest importance, is that IgG, just like traditional genealogists, are to follow ethical practices. They must protect the personal information and family ties of those innocent individuals and not reveal their names. IgGs must abide strictly to the terms of service of the consumer DNA databases and the standards set for IgGs. And IgG should not disclose any information about a case to the media without the permission of the investigating agency. So what are the standards that are being established? Well, in December of 2022, a call to action was issued in the Forensic Science International Journal, a peer-reviewed publication. It announced the formation of a board to establish standards, a code of ethics, and an accreditation exam for the field of IgG. I'll give you a moment to scan the URL code that has the link shown on the slide in the article. So who is IgG-AB? The Investigative Genetic Genealogy Accreditation Board was launched in 2022. The website identifies our goals, lists the biographies of our board and advisory board members, and answers frequently asked questions. You can use the Contact Us form on the site to indicate if you want to become accredited in the future, or if you want to volunteer with building the organization or have other interest in IgG. Who are the people developing the standard and the accreditation exam for people who want to do IgG? C.C. Moore and Dr. Margaret Press, mentioned earlier, are the founding members of the organization. The board includes Carol Rolnick from Parabon Labs, a seasoned IgG practitioner. We have as well Dr. David Gurney, formerly with the Innocence Project, and now the director of the IgG Center at Ramapo College in New Jersey. Myself, with my background in developing standards and solving genetic genealogy adoption and any NPE cases, serve as the recording secretary. Our other members are Andy Hochreiter, a genetic genealogy educator and an organizer of the East Coast Genetic Genealogy Conference. And lastly, Michelle Kennedy, a criminal analyst in law enforcement who chaired the certification commission for the International Association of Crime Analysts. We also have a robust advisory board composed of stakeholders from law enforcement, district attorney offices, forensic labs, and academia. The organization is a nonprofit committed to transparency and independency. IGGAB published draft standards for public comment on April 30th of this year. The standards cover terminology. We define terms that are used in this field to create a standard reference when discussing different parts of IGG. We have a section that discusses accreditation requirements and the exam structure. We lay out the professional standards in this document, as well as the core competencies required to be considered proficient. We document ethical standards to be followed by IGGs and provide for dispute resolution in those instances where unethical behavior might occur. Some examples of IGG terminology defined in the standard include establishing investigative genetic genealogy as the preferred term over what is sometimes called forensic genetic genealogy or forensic investigative genetic genealogy. The term DNA relative is used to refer to a DNA match to the subject. We define the term accessible genetic genealogy database, which applies today to FTDNA and GEDmatch, databases that can be used by IGG. The term investigating agency encompasses the organizations that have the responsibility and authority over the DNA in a case. And the term lead refers to the information provided to law enforcement as a result of the IGG research. The standard describes the core competencies that an IGG must have to be accredited. They include the ability to perform analysis and demonstrate skills in the areas of DNA and DNA relative analysis, investigation of genealogy and genetic genealogy, and the ability to do people finding of living individuals. And finally, to be able to communicate clearly and demonstrate those communication skills, both orally and in writing. The standard addresses 4 broad concerns raised in the article published in December of 2022. The first of these is data privacy. IGG has restricted access to the DNA relatives of the subject through the accessible IGG databases, and most individuals have no idea that they are part of a search. And IGG is responsible for keeping the individual's private data private. Secondly, IGG requires a critical mass of consenting individuals, those opting in for IGG, in order to do IGG searching. And the technique is vulnerable to restrictive government oversight if the public questions its use. Following standards and ethical requirements maintains the public trust in this technique. Thirdly, establishing standards and an accreditation process can provide investigating agencies with an objective way to vet IGG practitioners' proficiencies. And fourth, IGG will only accreditate those who have demonstrated the ability to practice IGG proficiently and ethically, and will provide a reporting and oversight mechanism for accountability that allows for sanctioning those who fail to follow the standards. When the exam is available, those individuals who successfully complete it will be maintained in a database accessible to investigating agencies and will be identified as accredited investigative genetic genealogist with the postnomial AIGG. So what have we learned? Well, we covered the evolution of genealogy in the US from our founding through today to IgG. We've defined what IgG practitioners are and how they differ from traditional genealogists. We've learned of the formation of the Investigative Genetic Genealogy Accreditation Board, or IGGAB, and the standards they have published and the accreditation exam that is in the works. How can you help this effort? You can support it by uploading your DNA results and a GEDCOM of your family tree to the GEDmatch database and opting in to law enforcement. You can also donate to the organization or volunteer at our website, www.iggab.org. If you have any questions, you can contact me directly at bbossert@iggab.org. And Olivia, I'll turn it over to questions from the group now.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Charles Wilson asks in the Q&A, can law enforcement access living DNA and my true ancestry?
No, they cannot access anything except family tree DNA, and only those kids of people who have opted in, and GEDmatch, and again, only the people who have opted in. I see someone asked if there was a handout. Olivia, if you can post one to the video when you upload it, I can provide a handout if you'd like.
Okay, yeah, for sure.
Okay, I will do that for folks. And thank you, Wendy, for bringing that up. You're right. I called it a law, and I knew as I said it, it's only an interim policy at this point from the Department of Justice. Yeah, all right. Well, anyone, if you do have something that you want to do one-on-one, you're welcome to contact me at that email address. And I encourage you to read the document that was posted back in December that I'll make sure that that QR code is also in the handout for you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We hope you will join us for our next webinar, which is on June 29th with Catherine Grant. She will be giving a presentation entitled Top Tips for Cleaning Up Fragments in Family Search Family Tree. A recording of this webinar will be made available next week. You can view that on our YouTube channel or on our website. If you have any comments or questions, you can always email us at fhl_webinars@byu.edu or follow Facebook and Twitter. Thank you and have a wonderful week.